Sometimes the loneliest souls find purpose in the most desperate moments. For 3 years, Elijah Thorne had lived alone in his mountain cabin, carrying grief that felt heavier than the winter snows. Then came the night when 2 women collapsed at his door, half frozen and begging for help. The younger one had wild braids and fierce eyes. The older woman looked ready to meet her maker. "We're dying," the girl cried before they both fell into the snow. Elijah brought them inside, thinking it was just a rescue from the storm. But when morning came, he realized these women were running from something far worse than winter weather. What could make someone chase 2 helpless women into a killing blizzard? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The wind had been howling for 3 days straight when Elijah Thorne heard something that cut through the storm like a blade through cloth. He'd been sitting by his stone fireplace, turning over the tarnished wedding ring on his finger, a habit that had become as natural as breathing in the 3 years since Emma passed. The gold band caught the firelight, worn thin from his constant fidgeting, a tangible reminder of the woman who'd made this remote cabin feel like home. Now it was just a shelter against the mountain's fury. The sound came again, human voices, desperate and raw against the wind's roar. Elijah set down the tin cup of coffee that had grown cold in his hands and moved to the thick wooden door. Through the single window he could see nothing but white snow falling so thick it looked like the world had been erased. But there, barely visible in the swirling darkness, 2 figures stumbled toward his cabin. One was supporting the other, both moving with the jerky, uncoordinated steps of people pushed beyond their limits. The taller figure, a young woman with dark hair, whipped into wild braids, was half dragging an older woman whose grey head lolled against her shoulder. "Help us!" the younger one screamed, her voice cracking with exhaustion. "Please, we're dying." Elijah yanked open the door, and both women collapsed into the snowdrift that had piled against his threshold. The cold hit him like a physical blow, but he didn't hesitate. He'd seen hypothermia before, back in his logging days when green recruits would ignore the warnings about mountain weather. These 2 were well past the shivering stage. Their skin had taken on the waxy, bluish tint that meant they were maybe an hour from freezing to death. He gathered the older woman first. She was lighter than expected, all sharp bones and loose skin, her breath coming in shallow puffs that barely fogged in the frigid air. The younger one tried to stand, but her legs buckled. Elijah caught her with his free arm and half carried, half dragged them both inside. The warmth of his cabin hit their frozen bodies like a shock. The older woman's eyes fluttered open, pale blue, the color of winter sky, and she whispered something that sounded like Martha. The young one was more alert, though her lips were blue and she couldn't stop her teeth from chattering. "Strip out of those wet clothes," Elijah commanded, his voice rougher than he'd intended. He hadn't spoken to another person in months, and the words felt strange on his tongue. "Hypothermia will kill you faster than whatever brought you here." He turned his back and pulled blankets from a wooden chest. Emma's quilts, still smelling faintly of the lavender sachets she'd sewn into the corners. When he turned back, the younger woman had managed to help the older one out of a sodden wool dress. Both wore simple cotton undergarments that clung to their skin, revealing how thin they'd become. The young woman's eyes met his brown like rich earth, with the intelligence that seemed older than her years. "I'm Sarah," she said, through chattering teeth. "This is my mother, Martha Caldwell. We came from Willow Creek Settlement." Elijah knew Willow Creek. It sat in a valley about 15 miles southwest, one of the small mining communities that had sprung up when gold was discovered in these mountains 5 years back. He'd been there once with Emma to trade for supplies they couldn't make themselves. "Elijah Thorne," he said, wrapping the larger quilt around Martha, whose breathing had grown more regular but whose skin still looked too pale. "What happened to you?" Sarah's face crumpled for just a moment before she composed herself. "Raiders came 3 days ago, led by a man named Clem Hawkins. Her voice broke. They killed the menfolk first. Said they were looking for something. When they couldn't find it, they started burning houses. She pulled Martha closer, and the older woman's eyes opened fully for the first time. Her gaze was sharp despite her weakened state, taking in Elijah's cabin with the practiced assessment of someone who'd lived through hard times before. "You got any willow bark tea?" Martha asked, her voice hoarse but steady. "For the fever that's coming." Elijah nodded and moved to his small kitchen area. Emma had taught him about medicinal teas during their first winter, when they'd both come down with lung fever, and the nearest doctor was a 2-day ride away. He kept a supply of willow bark, along with other herbs Emma had insisted they'd need. While the water heated over the fire, he studied his unexpected guests. Sarah couldn't be more than 19, with the kind of practical beauty that came from outdoor work and good health. Her hands, though soft from the cold, showed calluses from hard labor. Martha looked to be in her 60s, with silver-streaked brown hair and the weathered face of a woman who'd seen most of what life could throw at a person. Both women clutched something close to their bodies. Martha held a leather-bound book that looked like a family Bible, while Sarah's hand kept moving to a torn pocket in her dress, as if checking that something was still there. "The storm will keep anyone from following your trail tonight," Elijah said, bringing them each a steaming cup of the bitter tea. "But come morning, if this Hawkins fellow is determined—" "He is," Sarah interrupted. "He killed my father when Papa wouldn't tell him where." She stopped herself, glancing at Martha. The older woman's eyes had sharpened. She reached out and touched Sarah's arm with a gentle but firm grip. "Child, if we're asking this man to help us, he deserves to know what he's getting into." Sarah nodded reluctantly. "Clem Hawkins leads a gang that's been terrorizing settlements all through these mountains. They heard rumors about gold being found in Willow Creek, more than what's been reported to the territorial office. When they couldn't find any hidden caches, they decided someone was lying to them." "Were they right?" Elijah asked. Martha and Sarah exchanged a look. "There was some truth to what they heard," Martha said carefully, "but not what they expected to find." Elijah waited for more explanation, but both women seemed to retreat into themselves. He could understand that trust didn't come easy in this country, especially after what they'd been through. But as he watched Sarah help Martha sip the willow bark tea, he felt something stir in his chest that he'd thought was dead and buried with Emma. Purpose. The need to protect something other than his own stubborn grief. The storm continued to rage outside, rattling the windows and sending cold drafts through the gaps in the logs. But inside, with the fire crackling and 2 people depending on him for the first time in 3 years, Elijah's cabin felt more like a home than it had since Emma died. Martha's color was improving as the warmth and tea worked their way through her system. She opened the leather Bible she'd been clutching and carefully turned the pages. Pressed between the pages were dried flowers, wild flowers from some prairie, delicate and colorful even in death. "These are from the farm where I grew up," she said, noticing Elijah's curious look. "In Kansas, before the drought drove us west. My mother pressed them in this Bible before she died. Said they'd remind us that beautiful things can survive even when everything else is lost." Sarah leaned against her mother's shoulder, and Elijah could see the family resemblance now that their faces had regained some color. The same determined set to their jaws, the same way of looking directly at a person when they spoke. "How long were you walking in the storm?" he asked. 2 days, Sarah said. "We had to circle wide to avoid the gang. They split up to search for us, but they know these mountains pretty well. Better than we do, anyway." "You did good to find my cabin," Elijah said. "Most folks don't even know it's here." "Papa told me about you once," Sarah said. "Said there was a man living up in the high country who used to work the lumber camps. He said you were the kind of man who'd help someone in need, if they could find you." Elijah felt his throat tighten. He'd known Sarah's father, Tom Caldwell, a decent man who'd helped Elijah carry supplies up the mountain path a few years back when Emma was sick. Tom had been one of the few people who'd made the climb to attend Emma's funeral. Tom was a good man, Elijah said quietly. I'm sorry for your loss. Both women were quiet for a moment. Then Martha spoke up, her voice stronger now. The men who killed him weren't looking just for gold. They were looking for something specific, something they thought Tom had. Did he? Elijah asked. Martha's hand moved to Sarah's torn pocket, and understanding passed between mother and daughter. Yes, Martha said. He did. Cabin like a heavy blanket. Elijah looked at these two women, beaten down but not broken, frightened but still fighting, and felt the last of his self-imposed isolation cracking apart. Then we'd better make sure you're ready to travel when the weather clears, he said. Outside, the wind howled with renewed fury, but inside the cabin, 3 people sat planning for survival, and for the first time in years, Elijah Thorne didn't feel like he was just waiting for his own life to end. Dawn broke grey and cold, with the storm finally beginning to weaken. Elijah had spent most of the night stoking the fire and checking on his guests, but now he stood at the window, watching the snow taper off to scattered flakes. The wind still gusted, but the killing fury of the blizzard had passed. Martha sat up straighter in the chair where she dozed, her colour much better after a night of warmth and rest. Sarah had curled up on a pile of blankets near the fire, but her eyes were open, alert, and worried. "They'll be able to track us now," she said quietly. Elijah nodded. 3 people moving through fresh snow would leave a trail a blind man could follow. And if this Hawkins fellow was as determined as Sarah claimed, he'd be searching as soon as it was safe to move. "Tell me about this gang," Elijah said, settling into his own chair with a cup of coffee. "How many men? How well armed?" 8 or 9, Sarah said. "Maybe 10? They had good horses and plenty of ammunition. Clem Hawkins is the leader, a big man with a red beard and a scar across his left cheek. The others call him Captain, like he was military once." Martha made a small sound, something between a sigh and a moan. When Elijah looked at her, she was staring into the fire with an expression he couldn't quite read. "You know something about him," Elijah said. It wasn't a question. "I knew a Clem Hawkins once," Martha said slowly. "Long time ago. Before I married Tom. Before I came west. He would have been just a boy then, maybe 15 years old." Sarah turned to stare at her mother. "You never mentioned knowing anyone by that name." "Didn't see the point," Martha said. "Figured it was a common enough name, and the Clem I knew well, he was headed down a dark path even then. After what happened to his parents." Elijah waited, but Martha seemed reluctant to continue. Outside, he could hear the drip of snow melting from the cabin's eaves as the temperature rose slightly. The storm was definitely breaking. "What happened to his parents?" Sarah asked. Martha's hand went to her Bible, fingers tracing the worn leather cover. "They were killed during a raid on their homestead. Comanches, most likely, though nobody ever proved it for certain. Clem and his younger sister were the only survivors. Found them 3 days later, hiding in a root cellar. His sister?" Sarah said. "Name was Mary," Martha said. "Sweet little thing. Couldn't have been more than 10 years old. Clem was so protective of her after that, like he was trying to be father and mother both. But the anger in that boy, it was like poison working through his system." Elijah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. "What happened to them?" "Clem ran off when he turned 18. Joined up with some rough men who were hunting buffalo for the hide trade, left his sister with a preacher's family in town. Mary took their name, called herself Mary Hutchinson after that." Sarah had gone very still. "Mama," she said carefully, "what was your maiden name?" Martha met her daughter's eyes steadily. "Hutchinson. Mary Hutchinson was my name before I married your father." The silence that followed seemed to echo louder than the storm had. Elijah felt pieces of a puzzle clicking together in his mind, and he didn't like the picture they were forming. "You're his sister," he said. Martha nodded. "I haven't seen Clem in over 20 years. Heard rumors from time to time that he'd taken up with outlaws, that he was riding with men who robbed stagecoaches and rustled cattle. I always hoped the stories weren't true." Sarah's face had gone pale. "He's your brother, and he killed Papa." "Clem doesn't know who I am," Martha said quickly. "I was just a child when he left, and I've been Martha Caldwell for more than 20 years. There's no reason he'd recognize me now." But even as she said it, Elijah could hear the doubt in her voice, and he was beginning to understand why the gang had been so persistent in their search. "Sarah," he said, "what exactly are you carrying in that torn pocket?" Sarah's hand moved instinctively to the spot she'd been guarding. After a moment's hesitation, she reached inside and pulled out a small object wrapped in cloth. When she unwrapped it, a gold nugget the size of a man's thumb gleamed in the firelight. It was beautiful, pure gold veined with white quartz, the kind of strike that could make a man rich overnight. But more than that, it was clearly natural, not refined or worked. The kind of nugget that suggested there was much more where it came from. "Where did this come from?" Elijah asked. "Papa found it in the creek behind our cabin," Sarah said. "About a month ago. He was panning for enough dust to buy winter supplies, and this was just sitting in his pan like someone had put it there special." "Did he find any more?" Sarah shook her head. "That was it. But Papa was careful not to tell anyone about it except Mama and me. He knew what would happen if word got out. Someone told. Anyway," Martha said grimly. "Had to be. Otherwise, how would Clem's gang know to come looking?" Elijah turned the nugget over in his hands, feeling its weight. Gold fever had driven men to do terrible things since the first prospector had spotted color in a mountain stream. But this was more than simple greed. "He's not just looking for gold," Elijah said slowly. "He's looking for his sister." Martha's eyes widened. "What do you mean?" "Think about it. Your brother disappears 20 years ago, becomes an outlaw. Then someone tells him there's gold in Willow Creek, in a settlement where a woman named Martha Caldwell lives. Maybe someone mentioned your maiden name, or maybe Clem just heard enough details to make him suspicious." The color drained from Martha's face. "You think he knows?" "I think he suspects," Elijah said, "and I think that's why he's being so thorough in hunting you down. It's not just about the gold anymore, it's about family." Sarah stood up abruptly, pacing to the window. "Then we're never going to be safe. If he's looking for his sister, he won't give up. He'll chase us to the ends of the earth." "Maybe," Elijah said. "Or maybe we can use that against him." Both women turned to stare at him. "If Clem Hawkins is looking for his sister, then he's not thinking like an outlaw right now. He's thinking like a brother. That makes him predictable in some ways, but it also makes him dangerous in others." Martha was quiet for a long moment, her fingers still working over the Bible's cover. Finally, she spoke. "There's something else you should know. The reason Clem ran off wasn't just about our parents' death. It was about what happened after." "What do you mean?" Sarah asked. "The preacher who took me in, he was a good man, but he had strong opinions about justice and forgiveness. He kept trying to convince Clem to let go of his anger, to trust in God's plan. Clem couldn't do it. He wanted revenge against the men who killed our parents, and when he couldn't get it, he turned his anger on anyone he could reach," Elijah finished. "That's right. The last time I saw him, he was maybe 19 years old, and he'd already been in 3 fights that week. Told me he was going to make enough money to buy us a ranch somewhere where we'd never have to be afraid again. But I could see the violence in his eyes. It was eating him alive." Sarah moved back to the fire, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders. "So what do? We can't outrun him forever, and we can't fight a whole gang." Elijah looked at the gold nugget again. Then at Martha's worn Bible with its pressed flowers, symbols of hope preserved against all odds. An idea was forming in his mind, dangerous but possible. "We don't run," he said, "and we don't fight. We negotiate." "With my brother?" Martha said. "You don't understand what he's become." "No," Elijah interrupted. "With your brother, that's exactly what I understand. He's not just an outlaw anymore. He's a man looking for the only family he has left. Outside, the sun broke through the clouds for the first time in days, sending shafts of golden light across the snow-covered clearing. But inside the cabin, 3 people sat contemplating a gamble that could either save their lives or get them all killed. The gold nugget sat on the table between them, beautiful and deadly as a loaded gun. And somewhere out there, in the wilderness, Clem Hawkins was saddling his horse and preparing to follow their trail. The real storm, Elijah realized, was just beginning. By midday, the snow had stopped completely, leaving behind a world transformed into crystalline silence. Elijah stood in his doorway, scanning the tree line for any sign of movement, while Sarah and Martha prepared for what might be their last journey together. The plan they'd settled on was simple in concept, but terrifying in execution. Instead of running deeper into the mountains, where they'd eventually be cornered, they would head toward the town of Cedar Falls, a 2-day journey through treacherous passes that would force any pursuers to follow a predictable route. If Clem Hawkins wanted to find his sister, he'd have to do it on ground of their choosing. "You don't have to do this," Martha said for the 3rd time as Elijah checked his father's hunting rifle. The weapon was a .44 caliber Henry, worn but reliable, with brass fittings that caught the light like gold. His father had carried it through the Civil War and brought it west afterward, teaching young Elijah to shoot with the kind of precision that came from treating every bullet as precious. "Yes, I do," Elijah replied, running a cleaning rod down the barrel. "Tom Caldwell helped me when Emma was dying. Rode 20 miles through a snowstorm to bring medicine from the settlement. I owe him this much." But that wasn't the whole truth, and they all knew it. Over the past 24 hours, as he'd watched Sarah tend to her mother with gentle competence and listened to Martha's quiet stories about their life before the raid, Elijah had felt something shifting inside his chest. The numbness that had protected him since Emma's death was cracking apart, replaced by something that felt like purpose. Sarah was checking their supplies with the methodical efficiency of someone who'd learned to be self-reliant early. She'd found Emma's knitted scarf in the chest, where Elijah kept his wife's belongings, and now she wore it wrapped around her shoulders like a shawl. The soft blue wool brought out the color in her brown eyes and made her look even younger than her 19 years. "You should keep that," Elijah said, nodding toward the scarf. "Emma would have wanted you to have it." Sarah's fingers touched the wool gently. "It's beautiful. She must have been very skilled." "She was good at making things," Elijah said. "Always said idle hands were the devil's workshop, so she kept herself busy. Knitting, sewing, preserving food. Made this cabin feel like a real home." The memory brought both pain and unexpected comfort. For 3 years, he'd avoided touching Emma's things, as if using them would somehow diminish her memory. But seeing Sarah wrapped in that scarf felt right, like Emma's care was extending to protect someone new. "Tell me about the route to Cedar Falls," Martha said, spreading a hand-drawn map on the table. Tom Caldwell had sketched it years earlier, marking the main trails and noting potential hazards. Elijah traced the path with his finger. "There's a narrow pass about 6 miles from here called Devil's Throat. Only way through the ridge without adding 2 days to the journey. If Hawkins is tracking us, he'll have to go through there too." "Is that where you want to face him?" Sarah asked. "Maybe. Depends on how close behind us he is." Elijah folded the map and tucked it into his coat. "The pass is defensible, but it's also a trap. No way out except forward or back." They loaded their supplies into packs, food for 3 days, ammunition for the rifle, medical supplies, and the few precious items each person couldn't bear to leave behind. Martha carefully wrapped her Bible in oiled cloth, while Sarah secured the gold nugget in a pouch tied around her waist beneath her dress. As they prepared to leave, Elijah took one last look around the cabin that had been his refuge for 3 years. Emma's quilt still lay across their bed, and her favorite teacup sat on the shelf where he'd left it the day she died. For a moment he considered whether he'd ever see this place again. "You having second thoughts?" Sarah asked softly. "No," Elijah said, "just saying goodbye." They set out into the crisp afternoon air, their breath forming white clouds in the cold. The snow was deeper than Elijah had expected, nearly 2 feet in some places, but it was light and powdery, easy enough to push through. Their trail would be obvious to anyone following, but that couldn't be helped. Sarah proved to be a strong walker despite her ordeal. She kept pace with Elijah without complaint, often stopping to help Martha when the older woman struggled with the deeper drifts. There was a natural grace to the way she moved through the wilderness, as if she'd spent her whole life adapting to whatever challenges the land presented. "Your father taught you well?" Elijah observed during one of their brief rest. Stops. "Papa said the mountains don't care about your plans," Sarah replied, adjusting Martha's pack to redistribute the weight. "You have to be ready to change course when they tell you to." It was good advice, and Elijah found himself reassessing his opinion of Tom Caldwell. Most of the settlers who'd come west in recent years were city folks, drawn by tales of easy gold and fertile land. But Tom had understood that survival required flexibility and respect for forces beyond human control. They'd been walking for about 2 hours when Elijah spotted the first sign of pursuit, a thin column of smoke rising from the direction of his cabin. "They found the trail," Martha said, following his gaze. "How many, you think?" Sarah asked. Elijah studied the smoke, estimating the size of the fire. "At least 4 men, maybe more. Enough to split up and search multiple routes if they want to." The news should have been frightening, but instead it filled Elijah with a strange calm. After 3 years of hiding from the world, he was finally moving towards something instead of away from it. The sensation was both terrifying and exhilarating. As they continued up the mountain path, Sarah began to talk, not the nervous chatter of someone trying to fill silence, but the thoughtful conversation of a person sharing her history. She told him about growing up in Willow Creek, about the garden she'd tended behind their cabin, about the young man named David who'd been planning to ask her father for permission to court her. "What happened to him?" Elijah asked. Sarah's step faltered slightly. "He tried to protect our cabin when the raid started. Clem Hawkins shot him down like a dog." The simple statement carried more pain than any amount of crying or cursing would have. Elijah recognized the tone, the careful numbness of someone who'd learned that some hurts were too deep for tears. "I'm sorry," he said. "David was a good man," Sarah said, "gentle and kind. He carved little animals out of wood and gave them to the children in the settlement. Made me laugh, even when times were hard." Martha reached out and took her daughter's hand. "He would have made a fine husband." "Yes," Sarah said. "He would have." They walked in comfortable silence after that, each lost in memories of people they'd loved and lost. The afternoon sun slanted through the pine trees, creating patterns of light and shadow on the snow. Despite the danger behind them and the uncertainty ahead, there was something peaceful about moving through the wilderness with companions who understood the weight of grief. It was Martha who first noticed the changed quality of the light, the way it seemed to be fading faster than it should, with an odd greenish tint that suggested more weather coming. "Another storm?" Sarah asked. Elijah studied the sky, noting the high, thin clouds that were beginning to thicken. "Maybe. Mountain weather can change fast this time of year." They picked up their pace, but Elijah's mind was already working through the implications. Another storm would slow down their pursuers, but it would also make their own journey more dangerous. And if they got trapped in the open during a real blizzard, all the preparation in the world wouldn't save them. Behind them, barely visible through the trees, that column of smoke continued to rise into the darkening sky. Clem Hawkins was coming for his sister, and time was running out to find a place where they could face him on equal terms. The hunt had begun in earnest, and Elijah Thorne was no longer just a grieving hermit hiding from the world. He was a man with people to protect, and that made all the difference. The temperature dropped as they climbed higher into the mountains, and by late afternoon Martha was struggling. Her breathing had become labored, and despite the warmth of Emma's knitted scarf around her shoulders, she shivered constantly. Each step seemed to cost her more effort than the last. "We need to find shelter," Elijah said, studying the darkening sky. The clouds had thickened into a solid grey mass that promised either rain or snow, neither of which they could afford to face in the open. "There's an old mining cabin about a mile ahead," Martha said between gasps. "Tom and I sheltered there once during a storm, years ago. If it's still standing." They pressed forward through the deepening drifts, with Sarah and Elijah taking turns supporting Martha when her legs threatened to give out. The older woman's face had taken on a greyish pallor that reminded Elijah uncomfortably of Emma during her final illness. The mining cabin materialized out of the gloom like a ghost from better times. It was a rough structure, built from unpeeled logs and chinked with mud that had cracked and fallen away in places. But the roof looked solid, and more importantly, it sat in a small clearing that would give them a clear view of anyone approaching. Inside, the cabin was spartanly furnished: a stone fireplace, a rough wooden table, and sleeping platforms built against two walls. Someone had left a stack of seasoned firewood, and Elijah felt a surge of gratitude for whatever Miner had thought to prepare for future travelers. As he built up the fire, Sarah helped Martha settle onto one of the sleeping platforms, wrapping her in every blanket they'd brought. The older woman's shivering was getting worse, and her lips had taken on a bluish tint that had nothing to do with the cold. "Mama," Sarah said quietly, "how are you feeling?" "Like I'm carrying the weight of all my mistakes," Martha replied, but she managed a weak smile. "Don't worry about me, child. I've been through worse." But as Elijah watched Martha struggle to catch her breath, he began to suspect that her condition was more serious than simple exhaustion. There was something in the way she held her left arm, as if movement caused her pain, and her skin had developed a clammy sheen that spoke of deeper problems. While Sarah tended to her mother, Elijah explored the rest of the cabin. In a corner near the fireplace, he discovered something that made his pulse quicken: a hidden cache beneath loose floorboards. Inside was a canvas bag containing supplies left by previous occupants: dried beans, hardtack, salt, and a small bottle of whiskey. More valuable than food, though, was a wooden box containing ammunition that would fit his rifle. "Miners always looked out for each other," Martha observed, having noticed his discovery. "Never knew when you might need help yourself." The supplies were a godsend, but they also served as a reminder of how many people had passed through this remote country, most of them chasing dreams that would never come true. The mountains were littered with abandoned claims and empty cabins, testament to the harsh reality that gold was rarely found by those who needed it most. As darkness fell outside, they shared a simple meal of beans and hardtack, supplemented by the last of Elijah's coffee. The whiskey Martha refused, but she accepted a cup of hot water sweetened with a little honey from Elijah's pack. "Tell me about your life before Tom," Sarah said, settling beside her mother. "You never talked much about growing up with Clem." Martha was quiet for so long that Elijah thought she might have fallen asleep. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the distant quality of someone revisiting painful memories. "Clem was 7 years older than me, which seemed like a lifetime when I was small. After our parents died, he tried to take care of me, but he was just a boy himself, angry and scared, and carrying responsibility he wasn't ready for." She paused to sip her honey water, gathering strength to continue. "He had nightmares for years after the raid, would wake up screaming about fire and blood. I used to crawl into his bed and hold his hand until he calmed down. Made me feel like I was helping, even though I was too young to understand what was wrong." "What changed?" Elijah asked. "He started running with older boys who filled his head with talk about revenge and justice. They'd ride out looking for Indian camps, claiming they were protecting the settlement, but really they just wanted an excuse to hurt someone." Sarah frowned. "Did he ever find the men who killed your parents?" "No. And I think that's what broke something inside him. He needed someone to blame, someone to punish, and when he couldn't find the right people," Martha's voice trailed off, "he started punishing everyone," Elijah finished. "The last time I saw him, He'd been in a fight with a Mexican trader who'd come through town, beat the man half to death over some imagined slight. When the preacher tried to talk to him about forgiveness, Clem said forgiveness was for weak people who'd given up on justice. The fire crackled in the silence that followed, casting dancing shadows on the rough cabin walls. Outside, the wind had picked up again, rattling the windows and sending cold drafts through the gaps in the logs. "Do you think there's any goodness left in him?" Sarah asked. Martha considered the question carefully. "I think there's a hurt little boy buried under all that anger, but I don't know if that's enough to reach anymore." As if summoned by their conversation, a distant sound cut through the wind, the nickering of horses and the low murmur of men's voices. Elijah was on his feet instantly, moving to the window and peering out into the darkness. "How many?" Martha whispered. "Can't tell, but they're close." Elijah checked his rifle, making sure it was loaded and ready. "Maybe half a mile down the trail." Sarah joined him at the window. "Are they stopping for the night?" "Looks like it. I can see the glow of a fire." The knowledge that their pursuers were so close should have been terrifying, but instead Elijah felt a strange sense of relief. The waiting was over. Tomorrow, one way or another, they would face Clem Hawkins and settle this. "We should take turns on watch," he said. "They probably won't try anything in the dark, but we can't take chances." As Sarah helped Martha prepare for sleep, the older woman reached into her pack and pulled out something Elijah hadn't seen before. A small square of fabric that looked like it had been cut from a larger piece. "What's that?" Sarah asked. "A piece of your wedding dress," Martha said, pressing the fabric into her daughter's hands. "I cut it off before we left, thinking I might not see you married after all. But I wanted you to have something to remember what you're fighting for." Sarah's eyes filled with tears as she examined the delicate white fabric. "Mama, you shouldn't talk like that. We're going to get through this." "I hope so, child, but if we don't, I want you to know that being your mother was the greatest joy of my life. Even more than the happiness I found with your father." Elijah turned away, giving them privacy for their moment of connection. But he couldn't shut out the sound of Sarah's quiet crying or Martha's gentle words of comfort. It reminded him of the last conversation he'd had with Emma, when they both knew she was dying and tried to find words to say goodbye. Later, as he stood watch by the window, Elijah found himself thinking about legacy, about what people left behind when their time was up. Emma had left him love and memories, but also a deeper understanding of what it meant to care for someone more than yourself. Tom Caldwell had left his daughter the strength to survive tragedy and still fight for what was right. What would Elijah leave behind? For 3 years, he'd been content to let his story end with Emma's death. But now, watching over 2 women who depended on him for their lives, he realized his story was still being written. Outside in the darkness, Clem Hawkins was planning his next move, driven by a mixture of greed and familial obligation that had twisted him into something dangerous. But inside the mining cabin, 3 people sat planning their own survival, bound together by circumstances, but strengthened by something deeper, the recognition that some things were worth fighting for, even when the odds seemed impossible. The night stretched ahead like a held breath, and somewhere in its depths, the future was waiting to be decided. Dawn came pale and cold, with frost covering the cabin windows in delicate patterns that looked like frozen ferns. Elijah had maintained watch through most of the night, dozing fitfully in his chair while keeping one ear tuned to any sounds from outside. The gang's fire had burned low around midnight and gone dark, but he could still sense their presence like a weight pressing against his shoulders. Martha's condition had worsened during the night. Her breathing was shallow and labored, and when Sarah tried to wake her with gentle touches, it took several attempts before the older woman's eyes fluttered open. "How far to Cedar Falls?" Martha asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "A day and a half in good weather," Elijah replied. "Maybe 2 days, considering I'm slowing you down," Martha finished. She struggled to sit up, wincing as the movement caused her obvious pain. "Sarah, help me to my feet. We need to keep moving." But when Sarah tried to assist her mother, Martha's legs buckled immediately. She would have fallen if Elijah hadn't caught her, and the effort of holding her upright revealed how much weight she'd lost in just the past few days. "Mama, you're not strong enough to travel," Sarah said, her voice tight with worry. "Then you'll have to leave me," Martha said with quiet determination. "Take the gold and go. Find somewhere safe." "No." The word came from both Sarah and Elijah simultaneously, spoken with identical firmness. "We're not leaving you," Sarah continued. "There has to be another way." Elijah studied the situation, his mind working through possibilities. Martha was right that she couldn't travel far in her current condition, but she was wrong about their options. The mining cabin was defensible, well supplied, and positioned where they could see anyone approaching. More importantly, it was a place where they could control the terms of any confrontation. "We make our stand here," he decided. "It's better ground than we'll find anywhere else." "Against 8 or 9 armed men?" Sarah asked. "Against Clem Hawkins and his need to find his sister," Elijah corrected. "That's not the same thing." While Sarah helped Martha back to the sleeping platform, Elijah examined their defensive position more carefully. The cabin had 2 windows facing different directions, giving them a clear field of fire across the approaches. The door was solid oak, reinforced with iron brackets that would hold against anything short of an axe. Most importantly, the stone fireplace could provide cover if they needed to retreat to the back of the cabin. In the hidden cache, he'd found more than just supplies. Previous occupants had left behind tools, a pickaxe, a shovel, and most usefully, a coil of rope and several iron spikes used for anchoring equipment. With these, he could create obstacles and early warning systems that would even the odds. "What can I do to help?" "What?" Sarah asked, having settled Martha as comfortably as possible. "Can you shoot?" Elijah asked. "Papa taught me. I'm better with a shotgun than a rifle, but I can handle both." Elijah nodded, unsurprised. Tom Caldwell had been the kind of father who prepared his daughter for frontier realities. "There's a shotgun in the cache, along with shells. You'll take the north window while I cover the south approach." As they prepared their defenses, Martha called Sarah over to the sleeping platform. With trembling hands, she opened her Bible to a page near the back, where family records were traditionally kept. "I want you to have this," she said, carefully tearing out the quilt square she'd been carrying. "It's not just from your wedding dress. I sewed it with threads from my own wedding dress, and my mother's, and her mother's before that. 4 generations of women who loved their families enough to fight for them." Sarah took the small square of fabric, feeling its weight not physical, but emotional. The white cotton was soft with age, and she could see where different threads had been worked into the pattern, creating a history written in stitches. "Mama, you're going to be fine. You can give this to me at my real wedding." "Maybe," Martha said, "but if not, I want you to know that you carry the strength of all those women inside you. Don't let anyone, not even my brother, make you believe you're helpless." Outside, the sun was climbing higher, burning off the frost and revealing a clear, cold day. Perfect weather for tracking, which meant their pursuers would be moving soon. Elijah finished stringing his early warning system, thin rope stretched between trees at ankle height, with small bells attached that would chime if anyone approached without knowing they were there. It wasn't much, but it would give them a few seconds of advance notice. "Tell me about the other men in the gang," he said when he returned to the cabin. "Anyone besides Clem who might be willing to talk instead of shoot?" Martha considered the question. "I only saw them briefly during the raid, but there was a younger man, maybe 25 years old, who seemed uncomfortable with the killing. He stayed back while the others searched the houses." "That could be useful," Elijah said. "What about weapons? How well armed are they?" "Good rifles, plenty of ammunition," Sarah said. "But they're used to intimidating farmers and shopkeepers, not fighting people who shoot back." It was a small advantage, but Elijah would take whatever he could get. He'd learned, during his logging days, that most bullies were cowards at heart, brave only when they held all the cards. The trick was convincing them that the deck had been reshuffled. The first bell chimed around midday, a soft, musical note that carried clearly in the thin mountain air. Elijah moved to the south window and spotted movement in the tree line about 200 yards away. A single rider approaching slowly with his hands visible. "It's him," Martha whispered, having struggled to the window beside Elijah. "That's Clem." Even at a distance, the family resemblance was unmistakable. Clem Hawkins had the same sharp features as his sister, the same determined set to his jaw. But where Martha's face showed the gentleness of someone who'd found peace in family life, Clem's showed the hardened lines of a man who'd chosen violence as his solution to the world's problems. He was bigger than Elijah had expected, broad-shouldered and tall, with the easy seat of someone who'd spent most of his life on horseback. The red beard Sarah had mentioned was streaked with grey now, and a long scar ran from his left ear to the corner of his mouth. "Mary," he called out, his voice carrying easily across the clearing. "I know you're in there, sister. Come out so we can talk." Martha's hand went to Sarah's quilt square, clutching it like a talisman. "He knows," she whispered. "Somehow, he knows who I am." The moment they'd all been dreading had arrived. Clem Hawkins had found his sister, and whatever happened next would determine whether any of them lived to see another sunset. Martha drew herself up straighter despite her obvious pain, and something in her posture reminded Elijah of a soldier preparing for battle. The frightened woman who had collapsed at his door 2 nights ago was gone, replaced by someone who understood that this moment had been 20 years in the making. "I'm not Mary anymore," she called back, her voice stronger than it had been all morning. "That girl died when you chose your path." Clem dismounted slowly, keeping his hands visible but clearly aware of where his weapons hung. "That's a harsh thing to say to your only living family, sister." "Family doesn't burn down innocent people's homes," Martha replied. "Family doesn't kill fathers in front of their children." "I never meant for Tom to get hurt," Clem said, and for the first time his voice carried something that might have been regret. "He drew on us first, said he'd rather die than tell us where you'd hidden it." "Where I'd hidden what?" Clem's laugh was bitter. "Don't play games, Mary. You took something that belongs to me, something our father left behind." Martha exchanged a confused glance with Sarah. "Papa died when I was 10 years old. He didn't leave anything but debts and heartbreak." "He left a map," Clem said, "hidden in that Bible you always carry. A map to the place where he buried what he found before the Comanches came." Understanding dawned on Martha's face, followed quickly by disbelief. "You think Papa found gold?" "Clem, we were dirt poor. If he'd found anything valuable, why would we have been living in a one-room cabin with a leaking roof?" "Because he was saving it," Clem insisted, stepping closer to the cabin, "planning to use it to buy us proper land somewhere safe. But he died before he could tell anyone where it was hidden." Sarah spoke up for the first time. "The gold nugget we found wasn't from some old map. Papa panned it out of Willow Creek just last month." Clem's face darkened. "You found more? Where? How much?" The desperation in his voice revealed the truth that Elijah had begun to suspect. Clem Hawkins wasn't just an outlaw driven by greed. He was a man chasing a ghost, convinced that somewhere there was enough treasure to solve all the problems violence had created. "There is no more," Martha said firmly. "1 nugget, that's all, and it cost my husband his life." "You're lying." Clem pulled his rifle from its saddle scabbard but held it casually. "Not quite a threat, but no longer peaceful either. 20 years I've been searching for that map, following rumors, tracking down anyone who might have known our father. I know it exists." Martha sank back into her chair, the brief surge of strength leaving her as quickly as it had come. "Oh, Clem," she said, and her voice carried more sadness than anger. "You've wasted your whole life chasing something that never existed." "Show me the Bible," Clem demanded. Let me see for myself. No, Elijah said, speaking for the first time. Your sisters told you the truth. There's no map, no hidden treasure, just a woman trying to protect her daughter from men like you. Clem's attention shifted to Elijah, and his expression hardened. You must be the mountain man. Heard about you from folks in the settlements. They say you used to be someone worth knowing before you turned hermit. I'm still someone worth knowing, Elijah replied. And right now, I'm someone standing between you and two innocent women. Innocent? Clem's laugh was harsh. My sister stole from me, then ran off in the night like a thief. That doesn't sound innocent to me. Sarah stepped forward, her young face set with determination. She didn't steal anything. That gold nugget was my inheritance from Papa. The only thing he left me besides memories. Your Papa, Clem said, his voice dropping to something like a growl, died because he chose to protect a lie instead of family. No, Sarah said firmly. He died because he chose to protect his family instead of feeding your greed. The silence that followed was thick with 20 years of pain and misunderstanding. Elijah could see the conflict playing across Clem's face, the little boy who'd tried to protect his sister, warring with the man who'd let anger poison everything he touched. I got 8 men with me, Clem said finally. Good men who've followed me through hell and back. They're not going to let me walk away, empty-handed. Then tell them the truth, Martha said. Tell them there's nothing here worth dying for. The truth is that everyone I've ever cared about has abandoned me. First our parents got themselves killed, then you disappeared with that preacher family. Now you're telling me the one thing I've been living for never existed. I'm telling you that it's not too late to change, Martha said. You're my brother, and I still love you, but I won't let you hurt my daughter. Clem was quiet for a long moment, staring at the cabin as if he could see through its walls to the truth inside. When he spoke again, his voice was different, younger somehow, more uncertain. Do you remember the night before I left? He asked. You were maybe 11 years old, and you'd made me a wooden horse for my birthday, carved it yourself with Papa's old knife. I remember, Martha said softly. You told me it was magic. Said as long as I carried it with me I'd never really be alone. Martha's eyes filled with tears. Do you still have it? Clem reached into his coat and pulled out a small wooden figure, worn smooth by years of handling. Even from a distance, Elijah could see the careful work of a child's hands, every detail carved with love. I've carried it in every fight, every raid, every dark moment for 20 years, Clem said. Told myself that someday I'd find you again, and we'd be a family like we were supposed to be. We can still be family, Martha said, but not like this. Not with violence and fear. Clem looked at the wooden horse in his palm, then at the cabin where his sister waited. For a moment, Elijah thought they might actually reach him, might find the hurt little boy buried under decades of anger and bad choices. Then the sound of approaching horses shattered the moment. Clem's men were coming, drawn by the delay in their leader's return. The time for talking was running out. I'm sorry, Mary, Clem said, and his voice carried genuine regret. But I can't control what happens next. He remounted his horse and rode back toward the tree line, leaving the 3 people in the cabin to prepare for whatever storm was about to break over them. The sound of horses grew louder, and soon 8 riders emerged from the tree line behind Clem. They spread out in a rough semicircle, weapons ready but not yet aimed. Elijah could see the uncertainty in their postures. These men had expected to find cowering settlers, not a fortified position with clear fields of fire. What's the situation, Captain? Called out a tall man with a greying beard and sergeant's stripes still visible on his faded cavalry coat. My sister's in there, Clem replied, along with the gold and a mountain man who thinks he's protecting them. Your sister? The sergeant's voice carried surprise. You never mentioned having family. It's complicated, Morrison. Clem's tone suggested this wasn't a conversation he wanted to have, in front of the others. But Morrison wasn't easily dismissed. Complicated how? We rode hard for 3 days, chasing what you said was stolen property. Now you're telling us we're here to collect family debts. Elijah could see cracks forming in the gang's unity. These weren't mindless killers. They were men who'd followed Clem based on promises of easy money, not family vendettas. If he could widen those cracks, it might give them a chance. "Morrison," he called out from the cabin window, "you sound like a military man." "What unit?" "3rd Cavalry, Army of the Cumberland," Morrison replied automatically. "Who's asking?" "Someone who fought at Chickamauga," Elijah said. "On the Union side." There was a long pause. Several of the riders shifted uncomfortably in their saddles. The Civil War had been over for 15 years, but its divisions still ran deep, especially among men who'd made their living by violence since. "You calling me a traitor?" Morrison asked, his voice tight. "I'm calling you a soldier," Elijah replied. "Question is, what kind of war are you fighting now?" Martha struggled to her feet and moved to the window beside Elijah. Her face was pale but determined as she addressed the men outside. "Sergeant Morrison," she called, "did my brother tell you he was planning to rob his own sister? Did he mention that the stolen gold belongs to my dead husband's estate?" Murmurs rippled through the group. Elijah could see several of the younger men exchanging uncertain glances. Whatever Clem had told them to get them here, it wasn't the whole truth. "Captain," said a voice from the back of the group, a young man with sandy hair and nervous eyes, "maybe we should hear what they have to say." "Shut up, Billy," Clem snapped. "You don't know what you're talking about." But Billy wasn't deterred. "I know we came here to recover stolen property, not to fight family disputes. And I know that woman don't look like no thief to me." Martha reached into her dress and pulled out a folded paper yellowed with age and worn from handling. "Sergeant Morrison," she called, "this is my marriage certificate. Martha Hutchinson Caldwell, wed to Thomas Caldwell in Willow Creek Settlement, witnessed by Pastor Jonathan Mills. The gold your captain claims I stole was found on my late husband's property." She held the paper up so they could see it, though none of them were close enough to read the details. "If you want to verify this, Pastor Mills is still alive in Cedar Falls. He'll confirm everything I've said." Morrison rode closer, his eyes fixed on the document. "Captain, if what she's saying is true—" "It's not," Clem interrupted, but his voice lacked conviction. "She's lying to save her own skin." "Then let's see this famous map you've been talking about," Morrison said. "The one you said was hidden in her Bible. If it's real, it should be easy enough to prove." All eyes turned to Clem, who suddenly looked less like a commanding leader and more like a man whose carefully constructed lies were crumbling around him. Elijah could see the moment when he realized his own men were beginning to doubt him. "The map is there," Clem said desperately. "I know it is. My father told me." "Your father told you?" Morrison's voice was sharp with disbelief. "I thought you said your father died when you were young." The silence that followed was deafening. Several of the gang members were now openly staring at their leader, waiting for an explanation that didn't come. It was Martha who finally broke the silence. "Clem," she said gently, "show them the wanted poster." "What wanted poster?" Morrison demanded. Martha's voice carried infinite sadness. "The one in my Bible. The one with my brother's picture on it, offering $1,000 reward for information leading to his capture." All color drained from Clem's face. "Mary, don't—" "I've been carrying it for 5 years," Martha continued, "ever since I saw it, posted in the territorial capital, hoping someday I'd have the courage to turn you in myself, before you hurt anyone else." She reached into her Bible with trembling hands and pulled out a folded piece of paper. Even from a distance, Elijah could see the crude woodcut portrait and bold lettering that marked it as an official wanted poster. "Clem Hawkins," she read aloud, "wanted for robbery, murder, and crimes against the territorial peace. Last seen in the company of 8 to 10 armed men operating throughout the mountain territories." The effect on the gang was immediate and electric. Men who'd followed Clem for months or years suddenly realized they'd been riding with someone whose capture would make them all rich. The bonds of loyalty that had held the group together began to dissolve like sugar in water. $1,000, whispered one of the younger men. Split 9 ways. That's better money than we've seen in a year, added another. Morrison's hand had moved to his sidearm. Captain, I think we need to have a conversation about leadership. But Clem was no longer listening. His attention was fixed entirely on his sister, and his face showed the raw pain of someone whose last illusion had been stripped away. You've been planning to betray me all along, he said. I've been planning to save you, Martha replied. But you have to want to be saved. The wooden horse was still in Clem's hand, and he looked at it now, as if seeing it for the first time. You gave me this to keep me safe, but it didn't work, did it? Nothing worked. It kept you alive, Martha said. That's something. Around them, the gang continued to argue among themselves, but the confrontation had shifted. This was no longer about gold or family debts. It was about a broken man facing the consequences of choices made long ago, while the people who'd followed him decided whether loyalty was worth more than reward money. The plot had twisted in a way none of them had anticipated, and the next few minutes would determine who walked away from this clearing alive. The tension in the clearing was like a drawn bowstring, ready to snap at the slightest provocation. Morrison had his hand on his gun. 3 other gang members were eyeing Clem with calculating expressions, and the rest looked ready to bolt at the first sign of shooting. Only young Billy seemed genuinely conflicted, torn between loyalty to his captain and the reality of what $1,000 reward could mean to a poor man. Inside the cabin, Elijah assessed their situation with the cold calculation of someone who'd learned to think tactically during his years in the logging camps. The gang was fracturing, but that made them more dangerous, not less. Desperate men with nothing left to lose were capable of anything. Sarah, he said quietly, can you see the north approach from your window? Yes. 2 men have circled round that way. They're trying to get behind us. Martha had sunk back into her chair, the effort of confronting her brother having drained what little strength she had left. But her hands were steady as she opened her Bible and pulled out something Elijah hadn't seen before, a small wooden chess piece, a king carved from dark wood. What's that? He asked. Something Tom made for me years ago, Martha said. He said every woman needed to remember she was royalty in her own home, worth protecting and defending. She smiled weakly. He carved a whole set, piece by piece, during the long winter evenings. Said chess was like life. You had to think 3 moves ahead to survive. The chess piece gave Elijah an idea. He'd learned the game from his father, who'd insisted that strategy was more important than strength in any conflict. Right now, they were playing a complex game with multiple opponents, each with different objectives. Morrison wants the reward money, he murmured, thinking out loud. Billy wants to do the right thing. The others just want to get out alive. And Clem wants to believe he's not the villain in this story, Martha finished. But he's running out of ways to avoid the truth. Outside, the argument had grown heated. Morrison was now openly challenging Clem's leadership, while 2 of the younger men had begun positioning themselves for a clear shot at their former captain. The $1,000 reward had transformed allies into potential enemies in a matter of minutes. We could just ride away, Billy was saying. Leave them be and split up. No one has to get hurt. Speak for yourself, snarled one of the older men, a scarred brute with dead eyes. I've got 3 months' pay coming, and I ain't riding away empty-handed. Then take it up with Morrison, Billy shot back. He's the one talking about collecting bounties instead of doing the job we came for. Elijah could see the fracture lines spreading through the group like cracks in ice. The key was timing. He needed to act before Clem regained control, or before the situation devolved into a general firefight. Sarah, he said, I need you to do something that's going to seem crazy. What? When I give the signal, I want you to walk outside with your hands up. Tell them you want to surrender the gold. Sarah stared at him. That's not crazy. It's suicidal. No, it's chess, Elijah said. Trust me. Martha understood first. You want to force them to choose sides. Make them declare their intentions before the shooting starts. Exactly. Right now, they're all pretending they want the same thing. But if Sarah walks out there with the gold, they'll have to show their true colors. It was a dangerous gambit, but it was better than waiting for the gang to organize a coordinated assault. And it had the advantage of appealing to the better angels of men like Billy, who might hesitate to shoot an unarmed young woman. I'll do it, Sarah said, though her voice trembled slightly. But what if they just take the gold and kill us anyway? Then we'll be no worse off than we are now, Elijah said, but I'm betting they won't. Not all of them anyway. Martha reached out and took Sarah's hand, pressing the chess piece into her palm. For luck, she said. Remember, you're royalty. Act like it. Sarah squared her shoulders and moved toward the door. Just before she opened it, she looked back at Elijah. If this goes wrong, it won't, he said with more confidence than he felt. Trust the plan. The door opened, and Sarah stepped into the pale afternoon sunlight with her hands raised. In her left hand, the gold nugget caught the light like a small sun. In her right, she clutched the wooden chess king. I want to make a deal, she called out, her young voice carrying clearly across the clearing. All conversation stopped. Every man in the gang turned to stare at the slender figure standing in the cabin doorway, and Elijah could see the calculations running through their minds. Here was what they'd come for, offered freely. But the why of it made them suspicious. What kind of deal? Morrison asked, his voice cautious. I give you the gold, Sarah said, and you let us go. No shooting, no one gets hurt, everyone walks away. What's the catch? This from the scarred man whose hand had moved to his rifle. No catch. Just a trade. Gold for safe passage. Clem had been silent during this exchange, staring at his sister through the cabin window. Now he spoke up, his voice hollow. She's trying to protect you, Mary, just like you always protected me. That's what family does, Martha called back. Even when it's hard, even when it hurts. The words seemed to hit Clem like physical blows. He dismounted slowly and walked toward the cabin, his men watching him with varying degrees of suspicion and concern. 30 yards, Elijah murmured to himself, tracking Clem's approach. 25. 20. At 15 yards, Clem stopped. Mary, I need you to know something. I never meant for any of this to happen. I was just looking for— I know what you were looking for, Martha said gently. The same thing we're all looking for. A way to make the pain stop. I found the wrong way, Clem said, didn't I? Behind him, Morrison and 2 other men had their weapons drawn, though they weren't yet pointing them at anyone in particular. The situation was balanced on a knife's edge, and the slightest movement could send it spinning into violence. It's not too late, Martha said. You can still choose a different path. Clem looked at the wooden horse in his hand, then at his sister, then at the gold nugget Sarah held. When he spoke again, his voice was steady for the first time all day. No, he said. I think it is too late. But maybe I can choose how this ends. He turned to face his men, and Elijah saw something change in his posture, a straightening of the shoulders, a lifting of the chin. Whatever decision Clem had reached, he'd found some measure of peace in it. Morrison, Clem said, you want that reward money? I want what's fair, Morrison replied carefully. Then take it, Clem said, and threw his gun belt to the ground. I surrender. The clearing erupted into chaos as men who'd been allies seconds before suddenly found themselves on opposite sides of an impossible choice. And in the center of it all, Sarah stood holding a piece of gold that had cost more lives than it would ever be worth, while inside the cabin 2 people prepared for whatever storm was about to break over them all. The climax was building like a thunderhead on the horizon, dark and full of lightning, ready to change everything in its path. The moment Clem's gun belt hit the ground, Everything went to hell. Morrison's rifle swung toward his former captain, but the scarred man was faster, putting a bullet through Morrison's shoulder that spun him around and dropped him to his knees. Billy drew his sidearm but hesitated, unsure who to aim at in the sudden chaos. "Nobody move!" the scarred man shouted, his rifle now covering both Clem and the cabin. "I'm taking charge here." But his authority lasted exactly as long as it took for two of the other gang members to realize that a wounded Morrison was still worth more than a healthy outlaw they barely knew. Gunfire erupted across the clearing as former allies turned on each other with the savage desperation of men who discovered there wasn't enough honor among thieves to go around. Inside the cabin, Elijah reached into his coat and pulled out Emma's locket, a small silver heart containing a pinch of soil from their farm back east. He'd carried it through 3 years of grief, and now he pressed it to his lips like a talisman before moving to the window. "Sarah, get down!" he shouted, but she was already diving for cover behind a fallen log as bullets whistled over her head. Elijah's first shot took the scarred man's center mass, dropping him before he could fire again. His second shot went wide as Billy threw himself sideways to avoid the crossfire between Morrison's supporters and the men who'd decided to collect the bounty on Clem. Through the chaos, Elijah could see Clem standing perfectly still in the middle of the clearing, making no effort to retrieve his weapons or take cover. It was as if he'd decided that whatever happened next was out of his hands. "Mama," Sarah called from behind her log. "Are you all right?" "Still breathing," Martha replied from inside the cabin, though her voice was weaker than before. A bullet shattered the window beside Elijah's head, showering him with glass. He ducked low and moved to the other window, trying to get a clear shot at the 2 men who'd taken cover behind their horses. The animals were screaming and rearing, adding their panic to the human chaos. Billy had found cover behind a boulder and was shooting at anyone who pointed a gun in his direction, which seemed to include most of the remaining gang members. His shots were wild, but frequent enough to keep the others pinned down. "This is madness," he shouted over the gunfire. "We're all going to die for nothing." He was probably right. The clearing had turned into a free-for-all, with no clear sides and no obvious way for anyone to win. Men who'd ridden together for months were killing each other over money. None of them were likely to live to spend. Elijah's third shot caught one of the horse killers in the leg, sending him sprawling. But the man's partner had worked his way around to the north side of the cabin, where Sarah's abandoned shotgun lay in the snow. "Sarah," Elijah called. "Man coming around the north side." She rolled out from behind the log just as the outlaw reached her weapon, and for a moment they stared at each other across 10 feet of open ground. The man was young, maybe 25, with the soft face of someone who'd never expected to die violently. "Please," he said, his voice shaking. "I don't want to hurt you. Just give me the gold and I'll ride away." Sarah looked at the nugget still clutched in her left hand, then at the chess piece in her right. When she spoke, her voice carried the quiet authority her father had taught her. "No," she said. "You'll have to take it." The young outlaw's face crumpled. "Lady, I got a wife back in Kansas. We got a baby coming. I need that money." "Then you should have thought of that before you chose to ride with killers," Sarah replied. The exchange lasted maybe 5 seconds, but it felt like an eternity. Then the young man's desperation overcame his conscience, and he lunged for the shotgun. Sarah was faster. The chess piece in her hand caught him squarely in the temple, and he went down like a felled tree. She grabbed the shotgun and rolled back behind her cover just as another bullet chewed splinters from the log above her head. From the cabin window, Elijah could see that the situation was deteriorating rapidly. Morrison was trying to crawl toward his horse, despite his wounded shoulder. Billy was running low on ammunition, and somewhere in the chaos, Clem Hawkins continued to stand motionless, as if he were watching his own funeral. The gunfight had lasted maybe 2 minutes, but it felt like hours. Bodies lay scattered across the clearing, and the snow had turned red in several places. Only 4 men were still standing: Billy, Morrison, 1 other gang member, and Clem, who still hadn't moved from his position in the open. "Enough!" Martha's voice cut through the chaos like a blade. She appeared in the cabin doorway, leaning heavily against the frame, but holding herself upright through sheer force of will. "Enough killing!" All shooting stopped. Every eye turned toward the frail woman who'd somehow found the strength to step into the middle of a battlefield. "Clem," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the clearing, "look what you've brought. Look what your anger has cost." Clem finally moved, turning slowly to face his sister. Blood from a graze on his cheek had mixed with tears, and his face showed the devastation of a man who'd just watched his world collapse. "I know," he said quietly. "I've known for a long time. I just couldn't figure out how to stop." Martha took a step forward, then another, walking toward her brother with the careful dignity of someone who refused to let pain break her spirit. "You can stop now," she said. "Right here, right now." "Mary, don't," Sarah called from behind her log. "It's not safe." But Martha kept walking, and something in her bearing, the absolute fearlessness of a woman who'd already lost everything that mattered, seemed to create a pocket of peace around her. Even the surviving gang members lowered their weapons slightly, unwilling to shoot someone who posed no threat. 20 years, Martha said when she reached her brother. 20 years of running from ghosts and chasing shadows. When does it end, Clem? "When I'm dead," he replied simply. "That's the only way this ends." "No." Martha reached out and touched his face, her fingers gentle against the scar that marked him. "It ends when you choose to let it end, when you decide that love is stronger than anger." Clem's composure finally cracked. He fell to his knees in the bloody snow, his shoulders shaking with sobs that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside his chest. "I can't take it back," he whispered. "None of it. All those people." "No, you can't," Martha agreed. "But you can stop adding to the count." From the cabin window, Elijah watched the reunion between brother and sister, his rifle still ready but his finger off the trigger. 20 feet away, Sarah emerged from behind her log, the shotgun in her hands but pointed at the ground. It was Billy who broke the spell. "Mom," he said to Martha, his voice respectful but urgent, "we need to get Morrison to a doctor. He's bleeding pretty bad." Martha looked around the press. Clearing at the carnage, 4 dead men, 1 wounded, survivors standing in the ruins of what had started as a simple pursuit. The gold nugget that had caused all this death lay forgotten in the snow, where Sarah had dropped it during the fight. "Sarah," Martha called, "bring me that gold." Sarah retrieved the nugget and walked slowly to where her mother stood with Clem. The young woman's face was pale but determined, and she moved with the careful control of someone who just discovered she was capable of violence when necessary. "Here," Martha said, taking the gold and pressing it into Billy's hands. "Take this to pay for Morrison's doctoring, and for burying the dead." Billy stared at the nugget in disbelief. "Mom, it's worth exactly what it cost," Martha interrupted. 6 men's lives and a family torn apart. Take it, and may it bring you better luck than it brought us." Clem looked up at his sister, his face streaked with tears and blood. "What happens? Now? You come with us," Martha said. "We'll go to Cedar Falls together. You'll turn yourself in to the territorial marshal, and maybe, just maybe, you can find a way to make amends for some of what you've done." "They'll hang me," Clem said, matter-of-factly. "Maybe. But you'll die as my brother, not as an outlaw. That has to count for something." Elijah emerged from the cabin, his rifle lowered but still ready. The immediate danger was over, but trust would take time to rebuild. Around them, the mountain silence was returning, broken only by Morrison's labored breathing and the distant call of a hawk circling overhead. The gold that had started everything was gone, passed to other hands to work its particular brand of magic. But the real treasure, the possibility of redemption and the power of family love remained, fragile but unbroken, in the space between a brother and sister who'd found each other again amid the wreckage of their choices. 3 months later, the Spring sun was warming the main street of Cedar Falls when Elijah Thorne walked into Hutchinson's general store. The sign above the door was freshly painted, and through the windows he could see Sarah arranging bolts of fabric with the careful attention of someone who'd found purpose in honest work. She looked up when the bell above the door chimed, and her smile was like sunlight breaking through clouds. The haunted look that had shadowed her eyes during those terrible days in the mountains was gone, replaced by something that spoke of healing and hope. "Good morning, Mr. Thorne," she said formally, though the warmth in her voice suggested their relationship had grown well beyond mere acquaintance. "Sarah," he replied, removing his hat. "How are you settling in?" "Better than I expected. Mrs. Patterson, the pastor's wife, has been very kind. She's teaching me to read better and helping me with the bookkeeping for the store." Elijah nodded, pleased but not surprised. Sarah had shown herself to be remarkably adaptable, finding strength in adversity that would have broken lesser souls. The store belonged to an elderly merchant who'd been looking for someone to manage the day-to-day operations, and Sarah had proven herself capable within the first week. "And your mother?" Sarah's expression grew more serious. "Some days are better than others. Dr. Morrison says her heart is weak, but she's comfortable. She spends most afternoons sitting by the window, working on her quilting." Martha had survived the journey to Cedar Falls, but barely. The combination of physical exhaustion and emotional trauma had taken a toll that even her iron will couldn't completely overcome. She'd found peace, though, in the knowledge that her son was finally facing his past honestly. "Has there been any word about Clem?" Elijah asked. "The trial is set for next month in the territorial capital. His lawyer thinks there might be a chance for transportation instead of hanging, given his cooperation with the authorities." Sarah paused, her fingers tracing the edge of the fabric counter. "Mama writes to him every week. She says it's never too late to remind someone they're loved." Through the store's back window, Elijah could see the small cemetery where they'd buried the men who died in the clearing. Simple wooden crosses marked the graves, paid for with the gold nugget that had cost so many lives. It seemed fitting that the metal which had brought death would now fund prayers for the dead. Sarah moved around the counter and walked with him toward the window where Martha sat in a rocking chair, her gnarled hands working steadily on a quilt that seemed to grow more beautiful each day. She looked up as they approached, and her smile held the same warmth that had sustained her through decades of hardship. "Elijah," she said, setting aside her needle. "Right on time, as usual." "I'm a creature of habit," he admitted. "How are you feeling today?" "Like an old woman who's lived longer than she expected and seen more than she wanted," Martha replied with gentle humor, "but grateful for both." On the table beside her chair sat several items that had become precious to her in these final months. Her Bible with its pressed flowers, the wanted poster she'd finally been able to throw away, and most prominently, a small wooden ring that Elijah had been carving during his evening visits. The ring was simple but elegant, carved from a piece of apple wood he'd salvaged from an old homestead. He'd been working on it for weeks, taking time to get every detail right. It wasn't meant to replace the love Sarah had lost, but rather to honor the possibility of love found. "Sarah," he said quietly, his voice carrying the nervous formality of a man about to change his life. "Could we step outside for a moment?" She glanced at her mother, who made a shooing motion with her hands. "Go on, child. Some conversations need privacy." Outside, in the warm, afternoon sunshine, Elijah found himself momentarily tongue-tied. He'd faced down armed outlaws with more confidence than he felt, asking this young woman to share her future with him. "Sarah," he began, then stopped and took a breath. "3 months ago, I thought my story was over. I was just waiting for time to pass, marking days until I could join Emma. And now, I know that some stories have more than one chapter. That love doesn't end with death, it finds new forms, new purposes." He pulled the wooden ring from his pocket, holding it up so she could see the careful craftsmanship. "I know I'm not young, and I know you've already lost one man you loved. But if you'll have me, I'd like to spend whatever years I have left proving that some things are worth the risk of losing." Sarah took the ring with trembling fingers, feeling its smooth surface and the love that had shaped it. When she looked up, tears were streaming down her face, but her smile was radiant. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes, I'll marry you, Elijah Thorne." Through the store window, Martha watched the engagement with tears of joy in her eyes. She'd lived to see her daughter find happiness again, her son begin the long journey toward redemption, and her own heart discover that forgiveness was indeed stronger than anger. The mountains that had witnessed so much violence and sorrow now stood as silent guardians over a new beginning. And in the warm spring sunshine of Cedar Falls, three people who'd found each other in the darkest of times prepared to write the next chapter of their story together, a story of healing, hope, and the enduring power of love to transform even the most broken of hearts. The gold was gone, buried with the dead, but the real treasure, the connections forged in suffering and strengthened by grace, would last as long as memory itself.